Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Let us begin with health and safety. So there are toilets available through the brown door to my right and your left, behind you, and also through the double doors. In the event of an emergency, we will exit through those sliding doors to my left and your right, behind you, cross the museum reserve, and gather at the bus stop for further instruction. I don't expect we'll have to use those instructions, but you never know. Hopefully, no unexpected health and safety tonight. So, no mai, hari mai, ki te otako whakuihu waka, ko Lisa Ellis aho. Greetings to everyone and welcome to the University of Otago and the annual de Carle Distinguished Lecture Series. I'm Lisa Ellis from the Philosophy Program. It is my happy duty, once again, to introduce Associate Professor Ben McKean on the occasion of this third de Carle lecture on climate change politics. As many of you will remember, Ben teaches political science at the Ohio State University, and before that he taught at the University of Chicago. We are all familiar now with the glorious experience we're about to share, so I'll just say we're looking forward to hearing today's lecture. Please help me welcome Ben to the podium.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Lisa. I think this mic should work. Everyone hear me all right? Great. Thank you, everybody, so much for coming. Thank you again, Lisa, for the introduction, and to the university, the philosophy program, to Carle, everybody for welcoming me here. Today, this third lecture, I'll be talking about trying to answer this question or think through this question: can popular sovereignty help us avoid climate catastrophe? So let me start with sort of outline of what I expect to discuss today, right? I'm starting from the premise we know what needs to be done to address the climate crisis. We know we need to reduce emissions. The question is, who's going to do it, right? Who is the agent of climate justice? Is it going to be scientists? Is it going to be governments? Is it going to be the global south? Or is it going to be the people, right? And I think that latter answer, that it's the people's job, the people will do it, is a common one. So I want to think through what that means. What does it mean to say the people will solve climate change, right? So to do that, I'm going to define some terms. I'm going to talk about what I mean by using the word populism, what I mean by the term popular sovereignty, what I mean and how it's different from state sovereignty. And then I'm going to talk about two ways of claiming popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty means the people rules. But what does that amount to, right? What does it mean when you say that the people are in charge or the people should be in charge? Right? I'm going to distinguish two different ways of making that claim. One that says the people have a kind of unitary will, that they're going to take control, and another that says when you're claiming popular sovereignty, you're refusing the institutions that exist. It's a more negative way of doing it. Then I'm going to add another two parts of popular sovereignty. How does popular sovereignty claim to represent the people? When a populist movement says it represents the people, what does it mean when it says that? How does it represent the people? Does it say it represents the people because the populist movement is like the people, and that the people are all kind of like each other? Or is there a different way of claiming to represent the people that relies on a logic of difference, that says the people are different from each other, but can still be represented by politics in some sense? So we've got two different ways of claiming power, two different ways of representing the people. I'm trained as a political theorist, but I am in a political science department, so I'm going to give you a 2x2 table that shows what happens when you have these two different ways of claiming popular sovereignty intersect with the two different ways of representing the people. What are the kinds of politics that get produced when you combine certain ways of claiming power with certain forms of representation? And I'm going to suggest that there's one way of doing that, making a kind of negative claim to popular sovereignty combined with a representative claim founded on difference that I think has some political potential for addressing the climate crisis. And so that's where I'm going to look to find some practical implications. That's the survey. It was probably a lot to pack in, but I think hopefully it helps to have a map. So let's start. If the people are going to solve the climate crisis, well, what do the people want? Unfortunately, it doesn't seem like they want to solve the climate crisis, right? If you do public opinion research, if you look at surveys, this is a survey of the United States from last year. Respondents ranked 17 other issues as being a higher priority than dealing with climate change, right? Including, importantly, strengthening the economy as number one. So if the rubber hits the road and it's like, do I want the economy to be good or do I want to solve the climate crisis? It suggests people are going to prioritize the economy, right, among many other things. When you ask Americans what are they willing to do to solve the climate crisis, they're not willing to sacrifice very much. Even though an overwhelming majority say that climate change is either a crisis or a major problem, only a quarter of the people polled said they'd be willing to pay an extra $10 a month for electricity to help combat climate change. In fact, even if you told them it was just a $2 a month tax, fewer than half said they'd be willing to pay that. Now, you might be thinking, well, that's Americans for you. Here's a more local survey, right? Even here, a country where I think concern for the environment in general is higher, you can see people rank 11 issues as more important than climate change. Again, notably including the economy, with the cost of living being the number one. Sorry, that's a little bit small, but I think you can see climate change and the cost of living highlighted there. So I think this is an important quote from the director of the Yale program on climate change communication. He says, we're not lacking climate solutions. We're lacking demand for those solutions. The public and political will isn't yet there to force the systems changes that are required. And I don't think this is an idiosyncratic point of view. If you poll people around the world, they also agree with you, right? So this is a poll of people around the world. How hard do you think citizens in your country are working to play their part in tackling climate change? Most countries in the world, clear majority say not hard enough or not at all. Notable exceptions, China and India, right? And I'll come back to this point about China in a moment. But in general, it's not an idiosyncratic view to say there's not the will to address climate change, even if we know basically what it would take. So for some people, that's a reason to give up on democracy, right? You can see here, Larry Allen Busk, who's a political theorist, says, we should replace the question of how do we give the people a voice with the question, why do the people speak so wrongly? And in a controversial article that was published in the American Political Science Review, right, Ross Matiga argued that legitimacy may require a similarly authoritarian approach to climate change. Now, he argued this to say, not in favor of authoritarianism, but to say we should really solve the climate crisis so that we don't have to deal with authoritarianism. But I think it's notable that it gets picked up and people think, well, maybe that is the way to do it. Maybe we need to give up on democracy to deal with the climate crisis. Happily, we have an excellent voice here in the room arguing the opposite. Lisa Ellis here has argued that right, this is not a reason, none of this is a reason to give up on democracy. This is a reason to deepen democracy, right? Surveys of public opinion tell us what people think now. But in the last lecture I gave, I suggested that the conditions of public opinion formation in what I've called the society of the spectacle are very bad, right? People are not able to engage in reasoned deliberation for the most part about politics. And so because of that, right, we don't need to take these public opinion surveys as the final word about what the people want, but it's a starting point, right? What this suggests is not that we should give up on the people, but that people need to become organized rather than to let existing institutions dictate to us what it is the people say. Right? So I very much agree with Professor Ellis when she writes, we ought to frame most environmental issues democratically, as how can most of us protect our interests in sustainability against the few who would pursue unsustainable policies. But even though I think it's right that people have an interest in addressing the climate change, we can't assume people are going to act on that interest. Right? For one thing, the forces of sort of fossil capital have much more power than the people when they're unorganized. Right? They have more economic resources, but also the way political institutions are set up are not set up to empower unorganized, ordinary people. right? And there's also more specific institutional problems, right? It's relevant that, for example, the Paris Agreement is a non-binding accord rather than a binding treaty, in part because of the very archaic setup of the US Senate, which would never approve a binding treaty. Right? So there are real institutional problems, too, that we need to think about that prevent people from acting on their interests. But it's also the case that we have other interests. We do have shorter-term interests that can obscure our longer-term vision. Right? For workers in the developed world, the use of fossil fuels is woven into the texture, the literal infrastructure of our everyday lives. Right? When I commute to work in a car, right, I'm doing something that's totally normal to me, and trying to change that would come with some real costs, right? It would be difficult to transition. Would it be worth it? Yes. But in a world where there isn't an organized agent of social transformation, it's very easy for me to default to those shorter-term interests, right? And that's true for workers in the developing world as well, right? Who may not want to give up their aspirations to live the kind of lifestyle that many of us enjoy. Right. So this pervasiveness of these kinds of conflicting or cross-cutting interests, I think, underlines the need for us to be organized and oriented in relation to the climate crisis. Right? Because in the absence of any effective and ongoing organizing efforts to reorient the way that we think about our interests, ordinary people are just going to focus on the interests that existing institutions and infrastructure habituate them to see and act on. So I want to turn to this question then. What does it mean for us to be organized? What would it mean for there to be someone or some group that can actually address the climate crisis, right? Who is the agent of climate justice? Now, I think this is a different question than the questions that often get asked about the climate movement. A lot of those questions are questions about strategy, right? They're debates about what's the composition of a winning electoral coalition, right, that could win and also pass climate legislation, or questions like, should electoral politics simply be bypassed in favor of a focus on direct action, whether that's destroying fossil fuel infrastructure or throwing soup at paintings or any number of other things that people do. Those are all strategic questions, right? The question I'm trying to get at is a prior question, which is, who's going to be undertaking the strategy, right? Now, I don't mean by this to name the particular individuals involved, like it's you or you, right? What I mean is, how the people who are going to undertake this strategy understand their collective identity and their self-organization, right? So it's not enough here to say, oh, the climate movement is going to be the agent of climate justice, because they're just kind of restating the problem in different form, right? That's the space where an answer needs to be. The question is, who's going to be the climate movement that wins, right? Who is going to be a part of that? How are they going to understand themselves and their identity? And how are they going to be organized? So, pardon me. I think any plausible strategy for addressing the climate crisis needs to provide an account of how people can be organized into a political agent powerful enough to transform our global economic order. That's a tall order. Right? That is a lot to ask. But I think that that's the task in front of us. Right? If we reject the idea of finding a collective agent who can transform the global economic order, that means we've given up on the idea that we can collectively, rationally, and intentionally change the way that we live together. So when I ask questions like, who will constitute a climate movement that's capable of winning, and what will lead people to join it and identify with it, how are they going to be organized? Those are very hard questions, but I think they're questions we need to answer, not only to address the climate crisis, but to vindicate the idea that we can actually make rational decisions about how we live together and put them into effect. So without this collective agent, right, without an agent that we've identified who's actually capable of changing the way we live together, our individual actions are going to lack the background conditions that make them meaningful. Right? So we can reduce our own emissions. We can skip that flight to go visit a sick relative. But if we do that, it's going to be ambiguous what it means. right? Is that going to be a needless sacrifice that we've undertaken? Is that going to be a futile gesture that we've made? Or is it going to be contributing to a collective project, right? Without a collective agent, without a climate movement in that sense worthy of the name, what we're doing is going to have an ambiguous meaning. Right, so I've got this picture here, where this is just from one of the anti-Trump protests in California over the weekend. People have kind of organized themselves in an intelligible way. Right? It says, hands off. And I mean something similar, right? But of course, in a different kind of register, right? Just standing on the beach doesn't mean anything. Standing on the beach in this pattern means something. Reducing your own emissions or undertaking some of these sometimes very strenuous efforts, right, to contribute to environmental causes, it may be important to do, it may be even morally obligatory in some sense. But as we think about what it means to do that, it's not going to mean that you've done something effective if you're doing it in isolation from a collective effort, right? And right now, because we don't have a large enough, significant enough collective effort to do this, our efforts to reduce emissions often feel like they lack efficacy and they don't mean what they should. So what does it mean then to identify what I'm calling an agent of social transformation? Right. I think giving an account of the agent of social transformation requires explaining three things. First, who would constitute such an agent and how they would understand themselves. And that's going to be most of what I focus on today. But also, affectively, number two, what would move people to participate in constituting such an agent? And why would they continue to identify with it or feel emotionally connected to it? And then third and finally, what political and organizational form such an agent should take? And that's a question that I'll return to in the last lecture in the series. But for now, I just want to point out we don't really have good answers to any of these questions right now. And I don't think that practice has outrun theory. Right? The existing climate movement is nowhere near to constituting an agent like this. Now, in history, we do have other accounts of the agent of social transformation, right, that we can use as models. So very famously, right, the Communist Manifesto gives very clear answers to these three kinds of criteria, right, in the way that it closes by saying the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains, they have a world to win, working men of all countries unite. Marx and Engels give a very clear answer to who they think the agent of social transformation would be. Right? Now, we don't need to agree with them that they were right at the time, but I think it's helpful to have that as a kind of model answer that many people want to emulate. The problem, of course, is that however self-evident their answers may have been at the time, right, appeals today to the proletariat as the agent of social transformation have lost whatever self-evidence they once had. Right, the integration of workers into capitalism through ideological incorporation and the receipt of material benefits has made class consciousness a much bigger challenge to develop than I think many people would have anticipated. So you can see that, for example, in the decline of class voting in elections, right? It's no longer the case that what people's income or wealth is a very good predictor of what party they'll support in an election. Right? And I think that's surprising for a lot of people, although this has been a decades-long process. So this is exit polls from the US from the presidential election last year. And as you can see, or maybe not because the type's a little small, but here's where things like income are in terms of predicting the vote. Down here you can see, on the other hand, right, being a black woman, hugely predictive of voting for Kamala Harris. Being a white man, very predictive of voting for Trump, right? Much more predictive than wealth or income. So who should we look to then as this kind of agent of social transformation if these old answers aren't good? So for the political theorist Jodi Dean, she thinks there is a clear answer. She says, today, neither proletariat nor working class functions in the way that it did for Marx, But in the course of working class struggles in the 20th century, a new generic identity did already appear, the people. And so Dean argues that the people works today just like the proletariat did for Marx. We can say, people of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, and have it be intelligible. And I think we can see some of why she believes that looking to the history of the 20th century, looking to, in particular, movements for decolonization, right? Mao in 1938 could write, in a struggle that's national in character, the class struggle takes the form of national struggle, which demonstrates the identity between the two. So this was a case where you could say, yeah, the people are the agent of social transformation. We need to become an independent, meaningful, powerful country, and that will be good for the working class. Right? They're the same struggle in Mao's view at the time. But can the people on the national level be that agent for us today? I think right off the bat, there's some obvious challenges in using this to answer the climate crisis, right? Climate change has an unavoidable global dimension. And so any national level struggle by the people is going to seem limited. It might even seem contradictory, right? That the interests of the people might be contrary to the interests of the world as a whole, right? And so to think about that, we might also think about the changing role of China in relationship to the climate crisis. Right? What does a national struggle now mean for China in this context? China has done more in terms of sustainable energy than many other countries, but is a victory for China the same as a victory for climate justice? That's not obviously so. And if we look at other countries, right, for most other countries in the world today, the struggle for national liberation and decolonization requires now a transformation of global structures. So although legally, formally, colonization has largely ended, right, what it's been transformed into is a kind of brutally unequal global economic order that has formal equality, but in which rich countries continue to dominate and extract resources from the poor countries. So insofar as these poor, smaller countries, formerly colonized countries, have tried to make efforts to support the working class in those countries, it's often been undermined by the structure of the global economy, by capital mobility that's moved production out of these countries as wages have gone up, by structural adjustment from the IMF and World Bank. All of these kinds of things that have made it the case that simply being a formally independent country is not enough to have achieved really meaningful self-determination, right? And so insofar as people want to pursue an anti-imperialist politics today, I think it's clear something like national level independence isn't enough. And that's an argument that I'll return to later on. Having said that, the language of the people still retains a powerful appeal, particularly when it comes to climate justice. Right? So you can see here, these are just a few of the climate movements, climate organizations that have tried to mobilize this language of the people to try to address climate justice, despite some of the obstacles I've already mentioned. Right? People's Summit for Climate Justice, People's Demands for Climate Justice, International People's Platform for Climate Justice. Right? So can we expect the people to come to the rescue? Right? There's very clearly been this populist turn in environmental politics and in climate politics, particularly over the past 15 years, since the failure of COP15 to reach a meaningful agreement, in the same time that the US Senate failed to pass cap and trade legislation right after President Obama's election. So that prior effort, which had largely focused on a kind of elite-driven, science-driven effort to reach agreements and consensus that saw politics and conflict as maybe jeopardizing the chances of reaching a climate agreement. Once that approach failed, we've seen this turn in climate politics to this more populist bent and to this appeal to the people as the agent of social transformation. In the US, one of the most, I think, successful, certainly one of the most prominent climate groups, the Sunrise Movement, avows itself explicitly as a kind of populist organization. They say, they call themselves a progressively populist group, and as populists, we want to appeal to the broadest possible public and create clear battle lines between ourselves and our opponents. However, I think it probably has not escaped anybody in the room that we've seen the right use this language of the people much more effectively than the left, right? The people, as often imagined in popular politics, is much more likely to be a climate-denying group than a climate justice supporting one. And so I think as we try to decide if the people can be the agent of climate justice, if appeals to popular sovereignty can help us address climate change, we need to think seriously about why right-wing movements that deny climate change have had so much success claiming that language of the people instead. Right? For many people, it seems counterintuitive they would do so. Right? These parties have often been the parties of elites defending unequal distributions of wealth, and yet they've been able to successfully claim this language of the people. Right? Why have they done that? And how have they done that? It's notable that as they've claimed to represent the people, right, as they've called for taking back politics for the people, they've done so in the service of a very hierarchical and exclusionary vision of the people, right? One that says the people are not immigrants, right? The people are not, right? The people are sharply differentiated from outsiders. So if we want to use the language of the people to support climate justice, we need to think about why that's been so successful and why that appeal has been so powerful. Now, of course, they have some other advantages. It's much easier to defend the status quo than to try and advocate for a radical transformation of the global political economy. And it helps that right-wing parties can also rely on an account of how social change can occur without politics, by embracing a vision of the market, where the market, if just left to do its own business, can create progress, right, through what Pierre Bourdieu calls a kind of sociodicy of the market, a kind of theodicy of the market, right? Well, then it's much easier to say, well, the people just need to do their job and the market will do the rest. Now, that kind of way of legitimating right-wing politics, or legitimating politics across the political spectrum, right, the legitimacy of that has been fading, right? Under the pressure of decades of rising inequality and slower growth, a lot of that story about the market being enough to have the rising tide lift all boats, right? That story hasn't been as persuasive to people. And so you can see this in the way that these parties now have an ever greater reliance on these claims about homogeneity and exclusion to support their politics. Right? You can see that also in the way that something like Trump's "Make America Great Again" slogan is much more explicitly nostalgic, right? It's not an appeal about a great future. It's about a return to a past. So to think through this language of the people, right, we need to get clear on some of these terms. Right, so I've already talked about this term populism, and a lot of people say, oh, the last few years of world politics have been all about populism. Right? Well, what is populism? What does it mean? So if you've read any of this academic literature on populism, you know probably like 2/3 of it is just arguing about how to define it. So I could really get bogged down here. I'm going to try to avoid that. Right? I'm just going to say populism, let's define it pretty simply. Right? It's a politics that's centered on a people, usually a national people, who are represented as the source of political authority, but they're oppressed, they're exploited, they're silenced by a powerful, corrupt, and self-serving elite. Right? That's the way populism talks about politics. So it's a politics that puts conflict over consensus, and that puts a high value on identifying a clear enemy, right? A clear opponent. And often that opponent could be an individual like George Soros, or it could be a group of people like immigrants, but it's usually personified, right? Usually it's not something that's systemic or structural, but it's going to take all those major forces and put them in the identification with a person or a group. So notice that there's two dimensions to this definition of populism, which I already kind of previewed in my roadmap. Right? One is there's the kind of power and authority that this politics claims that people have. And then there's the kind of representative claim it makes on behalf of the people. Right? Now, populist politics in real life often confuses these two, because the populist movements will say it's because we represent the people well that we deserve to be able to wield power. right? But I think it helps analytically to distinguish them so that we can see the different kinds of populist politics that are possible if we get clearer on the different ways we can claim power and claim to represent. So I've also used this term popular sovereignty, right? It's right there in the title. So populism is a politics of popular sovereignty, right? The popular sovereignty is just the idea that the people are the ultimate source of political legitimacy and authority. And so what populists will do is they'll say, well, but the actual political power in the world has lost track of the people, right? Elites have taken over these institutions. We need to bring them back to where the people are. The people, often they will say, need to take back control. Now, it's important to distinguish popular sovereignty, the people having power, from state sovereignty, right? State sovereignty is a related concept. It's very common in international relations. And state sovereignty says that it's the state that is the ultimate indivisible political authority over a given territory. And there's no higher authority over the state, right? If the state makes a decision, there's no one else you can go to say the state did the wrong thing, right? There's nowhere else to appeal decisions. Now, state sovereignty is certainly a significant part of the international politics as we've set it up. So the questions that I'm going to ask that are going to frame the rest of the talk are this. Can popular sovereignty help us deepen democracy? Right? I think the answer is yes, but it depends on the kind of power the people claim and how the people are represented. As we've already seen, there are many ways of claiming popular sovereignty that are, in effect, anti-democratic, we can say, right? It's a way of claiming the name of the people in order to exclude and dominate. So we want to avoid that, I think. And then there's this further question, right? Can claims of popular sovereignty help us avoid climate catastrophe? And again, I want to give a qualified yes, provided those claims of popular sovereignty can help us identify a viable collective agent of social transformation and deepen democracy. And there are real challenges here, right? Claims to sovereignty can reinforce state legitimacy and domination over territory, when I think we need stronger global institutions and less domination over nature if we're going to address climate crisis. So I want to take a moment to just talk about these challenges, right? Why is it that I'm skeptical about the state here? After all, many people think that popular sovereignty requires state sovereignty. The only way that the people can be given a voice is through the state, right? Through government. So, for example, here you have the legal theorist Dieter Grimm. He says, as long as there's no convincing model of global democracy, the source of democratic legitimacy and supervision must not run dry at the state level. Today, sovereignty protects democracy. Right? So he wants to say, if you want to protect democracy, if you want to protect popular sovereignty, you need to protect the state. Otherwise, you could be dominated by corporations or even by another state. And there's even people who've been optimistic about the state as a way of solving the climate crisis, right? So for example, Robin Eckersley, in her book, The Green State, says that we can detect a shift in the purpose of the modern state from environmental exploiter and territorial defender to that of environmental protector, trustee, or public custodian of the planetary commons. I think that's too optimistic about the state, right? I think that when we reinforce visions of state sovereignty, right, we're doing something that's dangerous, because that classic account of state sovereignty as a kind of power that's unlimited and indivisible and unaccountable is both normatively objectionable. I think it raises real moral concerns about what the consequences of that power. And I think it's also empirically false, right? I think it's a way of mystifying the operations of government. It makes it harder to understand what's really going on. Right. So in that, I follow the legal theorist Don Herzog in his book Sovereignty, R.I.P. says, today sovereignty stinks. It doesn't orient us towards our problems and possibilities. Right. And I think that's true about state sovereignty. So on the first point about state sovereignty being normatively objectionable, right, I think we've seen the ways that claims about unitary sovereign state power can empower the state in a way that very easily facilitates domination. Right? So this is a picture of Donald Trump with the German Nazi legal theorist Carl Schmitt, who argued that state sovereignty was an inescapable part of reality that we had to reckon with. And of course, for him, the fact that it was inescapable meant that we should just always kind of enjoy it, celebrate it. And so I think we've seen ways in which the idea that power is concentrated in one place in the government, right, means that it can be abused very easily once it's unaccountable to anybody else. So the idea that we have necessarily unaccountable government power seems to me very concerning. But I also think it doesn't help us understand the way that the world really works, right? And I think that especially when we think about the climate crisis, when we think about the kinds of economic transformations that are required to address the climate crisis, this idea of state sovereignty is systematically misleading. So states don't enjoy unlimited power or authority in many domains. They often fantasize that they do because they want to legitimate their power, or they want to augment their power. But when they try to realize that fantasy of unlimited power in reality, bad things happen. Right? So the political theorist Wendy Brown, in her book Walled States, Waning Sovereignty, argues that it's because so much of the world is in fact out of states' control that we see governments trying to put up border walls in so many parts of the world, because it's a way of trying to live out that fantasy of unlimited power, even in the face of a world of migration and climate change that shows that that power is a fantasy. I think there's some very obvious ways that state sovereignty is an obstacle to environmental protection and cooperation. When Trump pulled out of the Paris Agreement during his first term, he said our withdrawal from the agreement represents a reassertion of American sovereignty. But I think in a deeper way, the idea of the state as an ultimate authority provides no help for thinking through the relationship between politics and the environment. Right? So state sovereignty makes an absolute claim over a territory and the use of natural resources within it, in a way that I think is obviously incompatible with addressing a global planetary environmental crisis. Right? If you just give a government the license to say, yes, you have unlimited power over the oil in your territory, no matter what the consequences for the rest of the world are, well, you've made yourself a big problem. Right? And on a conceptual level, right, the political theorist David Temin argues that the very notion of sovereignty requires the active elimination, suppression, and disavowal of the interdependence through which the self is always materially and figuratively constituted. Now, that's a little bit jargony, so let me explain what he means. Right? The idea is someone who's sovereign, right, they're independent, they have power over everything. Right? So if it turned out that that ultimate power came from somewhere else and was in fact dependent on something else, that would radically compromise its claims to sovereignty. And so Temin says, the fact that we are dependent on the material world in this way, that we are shaped by it, is something that sovereignty has to disavow if it's going to appear to be the ultimate authority. Otherwise, if it turns out the ultimate authority is reliant on the environment, well, then the environment would turn out to be a kind of higher power over the sovereign. So I think this imaginary of state sovereignty is sort of systematically misleading about our relationship to nature. It also systematically misleads us about the relationship between politics and economics. Right? So to see this in a way that I think is relevant for the climate crisis, consider Saudi Aramco, which is the oil company owned by the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. Now, originally this was a corporation, it was the Standard Oil of California. It went through a bunch of corporate transformations before ultimately being nationalized by Saudi Arabia in the 1970s. Now, notably, as part of Saudi Arabia's strategy to kind of diversify its economic investments, the National Oil Company had an initial public offering, right? It sold stock in the National Oil Company. And so in 2019, they raised $25.6 billion in this IPO, which valued Saudi Aramco at $1.7 trillion. Right? So it made it, at the time, the most valuable company in the world. It's since traded place with Apple and a couple other companies. but it's way up there. But here's the thing that's relevant to thinking about sovereignty. The Kingdom of Saudi Arabia could not dictate what the value of that company was, right? They could decide to go to an IPO, but as I put it here, not even Hobbes's Leviathan can set its own stock price, right? There are still other forces at work that contribute to this being a significant part of, that dictate this outcome. The state alone cannot just say, hey, our oil company is worth $1.7 trillion, right? That's not something sovereignty can do. So I think the fact that sovereignty has that relationship to economics is significant, right? If we exaggerate the power of sovereignty and we say it's the ultimate authority, it's going to look like a really attractive way to quote unquote take back control of the economy, right? It's the ultimate authority. Who's the economy to say what to do, right? And so I think many people have seen over the years from both the left and the right, state sovereignty as an appealing way to resist neoliberalism. Right, or neoliberalism is kind of understood to say, the thing that's most important is free markets, efficient markets. And so it looks like you can just say, no, the state's more important than that. We get to be in charge. And so we'll take back control. But I think conceptually that's making a big mistake. It's already, in a certain sense, conceding too much power to both the state and to economics. Because what it says is, economics is a separate realm, and politics is a separate realm, and politics should be over economics. And then neoliberalism says, oh no, economics should be over politics. But everybody agrees these are two separate things. And I think if we're really going to address the climate crisis, we need to question that separation, right? We need a deeper kind of reorientation, right? There is no purely economic realm that's separate from other values, right? There is no purely economic activity. Every new pipeline is not just a market-making activity, but a change in our built environment that rearranges how we live together. In other words, it's a piece of politics. And so if we want to think about how the economy affects the environment, how they're related to each other, something like sovereignty is going to be often a misleading way to approach that. And I'll return to this in my 5th lecture. So, you might think, well, okay, let's just do away with not only the state sovereignty, but let's do away with popular sovereignty then. And in fact, we see some climate theorists do that. So in Climate Leviathan, Jeff Mann and Joel Wainwright call for a democracy so radical it's contrary to sovereignty. And I think that there's a lot of value in that approach. But in the rest of this talk, what I'd like to do is think about what value we can get out of the idea of popular sovereignty. In part because I think it's a very hard idea to escape. It's just one of the really fundamental constitutive terms of politics here. It's very hard to think about politics in the modern world outside of the idea of the people being in charge in some sense, right? So Kevin Olson in his book Imagined Sovereignties, right, says it's just served as a normative touchstone in our culture for a very long time. Imagined sovereignties have a potent existential force constituting our reality and setting the terms within which we act. This force remains even when we expose their origins to view. And that's partly because, as I've already suggested, we do live in a world in which these key political concepts have real force, right? We live in a world where they really do structure political institutions, and we can't just wish them away, right? So in my last lecture, we talked a little bit about imagined communities and the role that nationalism plays. And I think this is just part of that. Olson says Westphalianism is a silent bias in our imagination of popular politics. Right? And although I've argued we'll need to think beyond this in some ways, we can't just wave it away. So what are ways of making claims to popular sovereignty? Right? As I've already said, there's really two that I want to look at. I don't want to claim these are exhaustive, but there are two different ways of making claims to popular sovereignty. Right? One is a claim to take back control, which is the kind of traditional assertion of popular sovereignty. Right? It's this claim that political institutions have escaped the people's grasp, need to be brought back under control by the people. And then there's also this second way of doing it, of making a claim about the power of the people, which is the power of the people to refuse domination, which I'll come to in a moment. But I think it's notable that this idea of popular sovereignty is a claim to take back control, right? There's an assumption there that it's not only that the people can control institutions, but also that the institutions themselves can in turn control nature and control the economy. Right? And again, I've already raised some questions about whether or not we really want to embrace that assumption. Right? The claim to superiority and control reinforces the idea that politics is distinct from nature and distinct from economics, rather than inseparable from them. So what's another way to think about the claim to popular sovereignty, right? A way that doesn't depend on the idea of the people exercising a kind of unitary will, right? That the people control the institutions. Well, this other way is this kind of negative claim I've suggested, right? The idea of popular sovereignty as a refusal of domination, right? It's not an affirmative claim that we're going to take our institutions back. It says of existing institutions simply that their existence is incompatible with rule by the people, right? It's a denial that these institutions can be the people's. So, right here, you can see here in the photo, right, no consent, no pipelines. You can see there's a claim that existing institutions under capitalism deny people the opportunity to freely determine their relations with each other and with the environment, right? Instead, people are dominated, they're coerced into relations of exploitation and domination. That's one example of a claim of refusal. I don't, as you'll see, claim all forms of popular sovereignty as refusal like that. But I do think it's relevant that rather than seeking to express a unified will of the people in perpetuity, this way of claiming popular sovereignty leaves it open about what follows the negation of existing institutions. And it doesn't make a claim that the people are going to control what happens after that. So one of the reasons why I think this might be a valuable claim is that it's compatible with indigenous claims to popular sovereignty, right? Even if I'm skeptical about popular sovereignty in general, many indigenous groups have found the language of popular sovereignty very important to claim against settler colonial states. And so I think as whatever skepticism we might have about sovereignty, we'll also want to allow or take an allowance for some of the politically productive claims of sovereignty made here. Notably, I think a lot of indigenous claims to sovereignty are not claims for popular sovereignty as control. Right, you can see, Leanne Simpson, who's a member of the Mishisagik Nishnabek people, talks about body sovereignty against settler colonialism. David Temin traces a history of political thought among indigenous people who understand indigenous sovereignty as a relation of care for land. These are different ways of conceptualizing sovereignty beyond what I'm talking about here. And I don't want to claim popular sovereignty as refusal captures all of those, but I do think it makes space for those. Which, again, is important because there's also even debates within indigenous communities about whether or not they want to embrace the concept of sovereignty at all. There's also skepticism within those communities. So Billy Ray Belcourt, who's a member of the Driftpile Cree people, right, he says the concept of sovereignty cannot be the ideational house for those of us who are queer and or trans, indigenous, and two-spirit. So I don't need to take a position on these kind of arguments here, just to suggest that part of what I'm arguing makes room for these arguments to happen. But it's not the case that this popular sovereignty as refusal is always, let's say, good, right? There are many ways in which this refusal of existing institutions can be enacted, and I think it's relevant that actually settler colonialism itself also employs this kind of a claim. Right? So in Lorenzo Veracini's conceptualization of settler colonialism, he notes that the sovereignty claimed by settler collectives does not focus on the state and insists on the lawmaking corporate capacity of the local community in its self-constituting ability. In other words, what you get from a lot of settler colonists is a rejection of the state as impeding the people's ability to settle. Right? You have often a dynamic between settlers and the state where the settlers will say the state doesn't speak for us because they're trying to prevent us from killing indigenous people. They're trying to prevent us from settling, right? And then the state, and so settler colonialism also can negate the state form as it seeks to expand. So I think it's important as we think about these different ways of claiming popular power to not overly idealize any of them as being sort of by itself the right path to politics. All of these ideas can be used for lots of political ends. And so we'll want to think about how to use them in combination. So this is the last set of terms I'm going to introduce, right? I've talked about this kind of top line here of popular sovereignty as taking back control and popular sovereignty as refusal. I now want to introduce the other dimension of populism, which is how populism claims to represent the people. Right? And I think there's two different ways of claiming to represent the people. There's a representative claim based on similarity or homogeneity, and a representative claim based on difference. So a lot of the literature on populism suggests that populism is always what they call anti-pluralist. It's always the case that populists say that the people are unitary and homogeneous. I don't think that's right. I think there are other ways of being populist, but it's clearly the case that many forms of populism do embrace this kind of a representative claim. Right? They embrace this anti-pluralist claim that says they can represent the people on the basis of similarity. Right? These kinds of populist movements say they represent the people because they're like the people, and the people are like each other. Right? So populists say they can be good representatives because they resemble those they're speaking for. Right? So it's a representative claim based on identity. Right? And you'll notice that this claim to the homogeneity of the people and the homogeneity of the movement and the people can be reinforced by the idea of taking back control, because that idea of the people having unitary will fits nicely with the idea of the people all being the same as each other, although they don't necessarily go together. Now, it's not only right-wing populists that make this argument. Ernesto Laclau, who's one of the most important theorists of populism, and who himself thinks of the people as being a kind of replacement for the proletariat, makes this very claim about homogeneity. He says, the concept of populism that I'm proposing is a strictly formal one, for all its defining features are exclusively related to a specific mode of articulation, the prevalence of the equivalential over the differential logic. Now, he's using kind of post-structuralist jargon, but what he's saying is that in order for populist politics to work, people need to identify with each other as being the same as each other, more than they can identify with the differences. Differences are an obstacle to unity on this view. Right? That's what he's saying here. And I think it's striking how he connects this to sovereignty. So Laclau writes, almost imperceptibly, the equivalential logic leads to singularity. That is, as people are equal to each other and substitutable for each other, they come more and more to just be one point, right? And the singularity then becomes identification of the unity of the group with the name of the leader. To some extent, we are in a situation comparable to that of Hobbes's sovereign. Right? So, of course, the political philosopher Thomas Hobbes from the 17th century gave us one of the most famous analyses of sovereignty. And Hobbes is usually thought of as being someone who empowers the government, right, with an enormous amount of power by virtue of the sovereign. So it's striking here that we see Laclau saying this populist logic of equivalence goes all the way back to Hobbes. The idea here is if you're going to represent the people are all equal, and because they're all you can tell they're all equal because they're all the same. So I want to go back to Hobbes for a moment and see why he makes this claim, because I think it's very revealing about how populist logic works. Because if we go back to Hobbes and we think, well, why were people equal? What made them all the same? Well, it was that they could kill each other. Right? The reason why popular sovereignty is founded on equality for Hobbes is because we're all equally able to kill each other. And so this logic of equality, and this logic of equality as similarity, as homogeneity, starts here, right, for Hobbes. So without a sovereign to tell people what to do, right, equality is a state of war. Everybody's equally capable of killing each other, And so cooperation is impossible. And so you end up with a world of a kind of anxious stalemate. Because if you see somebody out in the world and they're different from you, well, that means they might be even more capable of killing you than you are capable of killing them. So difference is a sign of danger, right? Difference is a sign of a potential hierarchy and dominance. And so as you live in this world where cooperation is impossible, that means none of the good things in life are possible, right? This is exactly why you get Hobbes saying that life without the government is nasty, brutish, and short. So there's no opportunity for us to develop our differences from each other. Right? This only ends with the introduction of sovereignty. Now, even once you introduce a government for Hobbes, it's still the case that this, as it were, anxiety of equality continues. Right? Being different in the state of nature means that someone's possibly stronger than you and could kill you. Now, it doesn't mean that anymore once you're in society. The stakes aren't life or death. But it's still the case that being different is understood to mean either superiority or inferiority. And so what you get, if you understand political equality as being based on similarity, is an anxious society where people are constantly looking to each other for signs of difference, because difference means inequality. Difference means someone's either better than you or worse than you. And so that's a worry, because we live in a world where people really are different from each other. There's always the possibility of perceiving differences among us. And so you have this dynamic where people are constantly looking, right? Is that person superior to me? Am I superior to them? Right? People, of course, want to be superior. So I think even in the logic of Hobbes centuries ago, we can begin to see why so many of these populist movements regard difference as something to be dominated, as something to be excluded. And I think we can further understand that if we look very briefly at the work of Alexis de Tocqueville in Democracy in America, because he traces how this logic works in a condition of economic precarity. Tocqueville, coming from the aristocracy in France, comes to the United States, and he's struck by many things. But one is, he says, there's no country in the world in which private fortunes are more unstable than in the United States. It's not rare for a man in the course of a lifetime to work his way all the way up the ladder from poverty to opulence, and then tumble back down again. Right? So even then, he's perceiving a world in which there's enormous economic instability. And he says when the aristocracy of birth is supplanted by the aristocracy of money, things change. The immediate result of this is that all citizens are secretly at war with one another. Well, why are they at war with one another? Well, because they need to get ahead, right? Someone else succeeding might mean that they don't. And this is happening in a context that Tocqueville perceives as the opposite of aristocracy. Right? For Tocqueville, aristocracy is not just a government system. It's a way of looking at the world. Right? And it's a way of looking at the world that's totally contrary to the idea that being equal means being the same. Right? Because for Tocqueville, right, aristocracy means there's no exchanging between vassals and nobles. There's no question about those things being the same. And so in aristocracy, every space is marked, he says. Everybody has their place. There's no worry that comes up from exchangeability. You know where you are. Whereas in a democratic society, people need to create their differences from each other. But those differences aren't permanent. They can always be lost as fortunes are lost. And so everyone, again, is looking around, being like, am I equal to other people? Is that other person getting ahead? Right? Is that person different from me? Does that mean that they're better than me or superior to me? So if you've adopted this view of equality as homogeneity, as similarity, what can you do to eliminate or to alleviate this anxiety of precarity? Well, one thing you can do, of course, is to bring others down when they try to become elites. Right? And so Tocqueville writes, when everything is more or less on a par, the slightest inequality becomes an eyesore. That's why the desire for equality becomes ever more insatiable as the degree of equality increases. But the other thing you can do is to make sure there's someone who's permanently below you. And this is another thing that Tocqueville notices about America. White supremacy, And I think it's very striking that he calls racism and white supremacy an aristocracy founded on visible and imperishable signs. And he calls it that because this is a way of saying this is a break in the equivalential logic. This is a way where people are not equal. So even if I'm worried about another white person being a little bit different from me and therefore superior, I can always say there's this other group of people, right, that I'm always better than. It's a way of introducing that element of difference to alleviate the pressure of equality. And I think that's very significant, right? It says when you perceive everybody as equal, because they're the same, you need some way of differentiating yourself. But those differences aren't permanent unless we can fantasize a permanent kind of difference. So I think we can update this view about the kind of anxiety of equality and why it leads people to imagine or fantasize these permanent differences. Right? You can see that too in, I think, right-wing populism now. Right? Part of how we can see some of these right-wing populist movements differ from neoliberalism is they can say, no, there are people who are supposed to be winners and there are people who are supposed to be losers. And we can tell who those are based on race and nationality and other factors. Right? So even while claiming to speak for ordinary and working people, this kind of a politics justifies economic inequality twice over. Right? It says, first of all, that some groups deserve to have more than others. Right? And second of all, it says, you know what, don't worry about the inequality within the in-group. Don't worry about the fact that Donald Trump is a billionaire, whatever, because we're all part of the people, right? The mostly white people or whatever, right? And so I think what you see often, right, is these ways of saying, well, yes, we believe in the people, we believe in equality, but we only believe in the people being the people who are like us, right? The people who are similar to us. And so when we can find reasons to appeal to natural hierarchy, we're going to do that, right? Because any kind of difference has to be understood as either a matter of inferiority or superiority, so long as equality is founded on similarity. Right? Because if you claim to be different and equal, that looks like special pleading. That says, why do you get to be equal? You've already said you're different from us. So that must mean you're either better or worse. Right? So often, I think you'll find in these right-wing populist movements an appeal, right, to these kinds of natural hierarchy, because it fits very much with their way of thinking about equality. Right? Equality is similarity, but we are kind of all different from each other, so there's always this anxiety that needs to be alleviated about that, be reassured that we're equal. And so you find ways of saying, well, of course we're equal, because these other people are different and less than because of that. Now, again, I don't think any of that is inherent to populist politics. I think it's a byproduct of claiming that equality requires similarity. Right? But there's other ways of claiming equality, and there's other ways of claiming to represent the people. Right? So I think there's also a representative logic based not on similarity, but based on difference. Right? And so I think this quote from Angela Davis is a representative of this form of claiming equality. Davis says, "Black women have had to develop a larger vision of our society than perhaps any other group. They've had to understand white men, white women, and black men, and they've had to understand themselves. So when black women win victories, it's a boost for virtually every segment of society." So what Davis is arguing here is that black women are different, they're treated differently in society, and it's because they are marked as different that they can be especially good representatives, right? If a black woman puts herself forward as a representative, right, it'll be because they can understand other perspectives, and what will be good for them will be good for everybody. And that's not because they're like everybody, but it's precisely because they're different from others. Right? So it's a very different logic of representation than the logic that says we're equal because we're similar. Right? This is saying we're equal and different, and good representation takes account of those differences. So there's many others who make this kind of argument. the Combahee River Collective statement is a classic one in American politics. Stuart Hall, another good representative. I just want to make one other point about why this is a good way of thinking about environmental politics. Right? This logic of difference, I think, also enables us to have a much better understanding of the relationship between individuals and nature. And let me say why. Right? On the view that individuals are the same, that equality is about similarity, people are self-identical, right? They're the same as themselves, and they're different from their environment, right? They're different from what surrounds them, right? There has to be a kind of clear subjective will against the objective circumstances that that person inhabits. But if we accept that representation can be based on difference, then we can reckon with the ways that people are not even self-identical. People aren't even really the same as themselves in that sense, right? There's lots of contradictory parts of people. Representing a person can be as complicated as representing a group in that way. So if we accept the idea that people aren't self-identical, that they're not always the same as themselves, right? That we can accept the idea that there are porous and shifting boundaries between the self and its environment. We can come up with different ways of thinking about the relationship between individuals and nature and the global environment that we're trying to think about. So that's an argument that we can use this representative logic of difference to think differently about nature. But it's not enough to use that representative logic. Anybody can talk a good game, right? And so it matters how those representative claims are wedded to an actual politics. So I just want to briefly, you can see there's some ways in which people can use representative claims of difference in the service of environmentally destructive politics, right? So here, this was President Obama, often taken as a kind of representative of a politics of difference, right? The very fact that he was the first black president in the United States is often taken to make him a representative, and he will often put himself forward in that way, as being representative of what was good about America, right? That he could be a particularly good representative of the people because of the way in which he had experienced difference. But without that being wed to a politics of popular sovereignty, or right, where you have it just kind of a politics of representation connected to existing state institutions, you just get a new way of legitimating old environmental policies, right? So you have here, for example, Obama bragging about how America became the biggest oil producer in the world when he was president, right? So even though he'd been inaugurated, sort of saying, this was when the oceans would stop rising, domestic oil production rose 88% during his presidency, right? So it's just to say, right, when we think about this chart, right, it's not enough to have good representative claims, and it's not enough to have, as it were, good popular sovereignty claims. We need to think about what's at the intersection of those. So this is really sort of what follows. What occupies that bottom right space, right? Is there a potential political opening here? What would it mean to wed representative claims based on difference to popular sovereignty understood as a refusal of domination? So this doesn't have to mean anything in the immediate sense utopian. It doesn't mean, for all the skepticism I've expressed about state sovereignty and everything, right? It doesn't mean denying the existence of the state or immediately kind of moving to a commune, right? I think here about the politics of someone like Andreas Malm, who doesn't endorse the current international system, but who says at the end of the day, it will be states that ram through the transition or no one will. So it's not a question about, well, do we engage with the state or not? I think the practical question is, right, how should it be oriented to the meaning, function, and legitimacy of sovereignty in view of the climate crisis? Right? How are we going to begin to constitute this collective agent of social transformation? If we're going to use this language of the people, what's going to fill it in? Right? What's that people going to do? So I want to return to this point that I made earlier, right, which is that we need to make transformative claims about the international system. And to do that, I think we can argue that to make self-determination what it can be, in order for the people to be able to be themselves, right? We can argue that popular sovereignty can only be realized in a different global system. Right? And here we can draw on other people who've made this argument. So the political theorist Adam Getachew traces some of the arguments around the new international economic order in the 1970s, some of the leaders then of some of the smaller nations who realized that, as she puts it, national independence required international institutions was a key insight of the anti-colonial account of self-determination. So we can use this language of popular sovereignty, not as an argument for the people to go it alone, but that if the people really want to be free, they need to do it in a different kind of global order. Right? And so I think it's notable that this claim to national self-determination, for Getachew, she says, anti-colonial world-making envisioned dispersing and delegating sovereignty beyond the nation state. Right? So one of the things that I'll talk about in the next lecture is not just the national people, but what do we think about the people, meaning the people of the world? Can that be a political entity? So broadly, what I want to suggest is to think along the lines of what abolitionist organizers sometimes call non-reformist reforms. Right? Non-reformist reforms are demands that we can make to reduce the power of oppressive systems rather than shoring up their legitimacy. Right? A reformist demand might say, oh, look, the system can handle change. A non-reformist reform, right, is going to make a demand such that meeting the demand would undermine the system itself. Right? Either by revealing its inconsistencies, its irrationality, right? Or simply the fact that meeting the demand itself would require a radical transformation of the system. So part of the question is, right, what is the non-reformist reform that the people should be demanding now? Right? What is it that the people should say such that meeting that demand would require a transformation of the global system? Right. So I think one thing that's been raised that I think is a good candidate for this is debt jubilee, right? Many countries, many of the smaller countries that are on the front lines of the effect of climate change have argued that their sovereign debt should be forgiven so that they can have that money to adapt to a climate-changed world. Right. And I think that it's interesting to see that this demand has been met with, I would not say some success, but with efforts by the international system to try to accommodate it, right? So actually just in December, Barbados has been pressing this demand for debt relief for several years. They did not get that demand, right? Meeting that demand, I think, really would challenge the structure of the system by forgiving sovereign debt. Barbados did not get that. They got a kind of more reformist reform, which is a debt swap, where some of their debt was refinanced at a lower rate so they could spend the money on climate adaptation. Now, I don't think that's a revolutionary demand, right? But I do think it suggests that some of the ways where this could be pursued. Also, I think many of the examples of pipeline blockades are a good example of non-reformist reforms, right? The demand for land back is an example of a non-reformist reform, right? Those are demands that can only be met with a radical transformation of the system. And one of the ways where you can see blockades as a radical demand, right, not only is the fact that the Dakota Access Pipeline was built despite thousands of people coming to try to stop it, but you can also see that the kind of relationships that were enacted in the process of blockading the pipeline, right, in the words of Leanne Simpson, talking actually not about the Dakota Access Pipeline, but the Wet'suwet'en blockade. Right? She says, blockades are both a refusal and an affirmation of a different political economy, a world built upon a different set of relationships and ethics, an affirmation of life. And part of why that is because the process of opposing the pipeline also models a different relationship between people and a different relationship between people in that environment. So I think I've talked long enough at this point. I will just very briefly leave you with ad for the next talk on Monday, where we'll start from a very different point, which is the question of climate change as a global problem, and whether or not that's a better starting point than this national problem that I focused today, or does calling climate change a global problem erase some of the specificities of the different challenges that we face? Is it just a new way of kind of telling a new universal history that is going to leave some people behind. So that'll be on Monday. But for now, thanks for your time.
My head is spinning. We have so much to think about. We do have time for questions. If you have a question, raise your hand and I will bring you the microphone. There are people following us in the live stream and we want them to hear questions as well as answers.
Isn't it true that populism hasn't always been right-wing or even racist? Or people moving in populist movement have found they had to work together, for instance, black and white sharecroppers and farmers in the Farmers Union in the 1880s, or the populist movement against gold. And even in individuals, you had contradictions. And one of the reasons, perhaps, for the ruling class supporting segregation was to divide groups like the Farmers Movement and the Populist Party and the Union Movement.
Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, absolutely. And part of what I've tried to indicate here is the way that populist claims can be made to include, right, cross-racial solidarity, can include a recognition for an appreciation of difference. So you're absolutely right that the populist movement in the United States of the 1880s and 90s, there are a lot of contradictory strands, but many of them did model that kind of solidarity across difference that you're talking about. So much so, in fact, that actually, for example, Jan Werner Müller, who's one of the political theorist sort of experts on populism, who says populism is necessarily anti-pluralist, he wants to say, right, populism only is that kind of logic of homogeneity. He says the Populist Party of the 1880s and 90s didn't even count as a populist movement on his view. So I disagree with that. I agree with you that that kind of movement can be a populist movement. But I think it's very easy for any kind of political movement to go wrong because these ways of equating equality and homogeneity are very common in the world. And so it's just an easy trap to fall into, right? And so I think you're right. Not every movement is easy to pigeonhole as one thing. There's different strands in them. And I think you're absolutely right that we want to pick out and sort of appreciate the strands of populism that you're talking about. But we also want to be aware of why that other kind of populism has an appeal. I think you're right that it's often used to divide people, but sometimes people want to be divided, and we need to reckon with that part too.
Hi, lots of things, but one thing that occurs to me is you talked about economics and politics as being fundamentally like different kinds of values or systems. And it's often occurred to me that the economic corporations are much more dependent on the state than they like to think. So it's occurred to me, for example, that if enough governments in, say, Europe, or even state governments in the US, decided they really didn't like Elon Musk, there's something they could do without the elaborate apparatus of nationalization or anything like that. They could simply say, the protection of the state is withdrawn from Tesla. We're not going to enforce criminal laws with respect to offenses against Tesla. And then that's all. They don't do anything else. Then, popular movement would come in, smash all the Tesla, and that would be the end of Tesla, right? You could pretty much destroy the corporation just by withdrawing the protection of the state. So that was a point about, that was a fairly early on point that you made about economics is politics, politics is economics. But that's a particular way in which things which seem to be autonomous, like a huge corporation, multinational like Tesla, is actually dependent on the state in a way that is not apparent to lots of people. It's dependent on all the states enforcing the criminal law with respect to that corporation. There are other things I could say, but I wondered what you might like to respond to that.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's notable, though, of course, is that as politics has actually transpired over the past few years, if anything, it's more like the opposite has happened, right? And it's been more like, well, now the US government is operating at the will of Elon Musk, not the reverse. And so we'll also need to think about what makes that possible, right? And it's not just the US government, right, but Ukraine, right, uses Starlink, and it seems as though Musk has intervened occasionally to just shut it off for them. So I think you're right that it's certainly important, the role that politics plays in sustaining the state. I mean, the role that politics plays in sustaining corporations and the economy more broadly, but it also goes the other way, right? And so that's part of why I was suggesting we really need to think about these realms not as fully separate if we're really going to understand how they work.
Sorry. One thing I think was that you mentioned before about like pipeline blocking being basically it's a way of, it's both different and it involves, it's non-discriminatory, and it means that different people can like, you know, it's like rejects domination, but like, I'm just not sure whether that, like, because I think you did mention before whether the statement that it has is effective or not, like, because, you know, if, like, even if there were like 10,000 people, I mean, maybe not, like, it would be nice if like 10,000 people showed up to like block a pipeline, but like, how do we get the people to be united like that is my question.
Well, so part of why I was holding out the Dakota Access Pipeline protests as an example is that you did get 10,000 people there in the middle of the Dakotas, in like a quite remote part of the United States. So it really was a major, remarkable national mobilization. And I do think that part of what's important about it is that it is, so this was a mobilization that happened on US territory, but connected to a defense of the indigenous land of the Standing Rock Sioux people. And so part of what made it, I think, radical was that it did kind of model a way of saying, there's other ways of being in relationship to this land that aren't just resource extraction and sort of, as it were, political domination. Now, I think it's relevant that it wasn't big enough to win in that sense, right? It nevertheless was kind of, like the federal government took quite serious action to evict it. But it clearly represented a serious threat to the existing order, and so to that extent, I think we can look towards it as ways of being of suggesting potential political openings.
Okay, so like basically just more like basically just developing on that.
Yeah, I mean, I've framed this question in a way that's almost impossible to answer because I've asked, who is the agent of social transformation? And that's not really a question I can answer from an armchair, right? We kind of need to go out and try to build that collective political actor. So I'm suggesting some places we might look for possibilities of doing that, but it's not the kind of question I can say like, here's your answer.
Hello. Have you had a chance to contemplate the occupation of the Parliament grounds more than a year ago in New Zealand, about its sovereignty and popularism?
No, I mean, that's not a case that I know that much about.
Okay. Yeah, I suppose it's a little bit like trying to take Capitol Hill, but it did have a greater diversity in that it was opposed to the vaccine mandate as a state imposition against the people.
It's a tough one because you weren't here. Maybe you want to talk about the January 6th.
Well, so I think, so January 6th is an example, but that's a good example of the kind of sort of, it's not an example of settler colonialism, but it's an example of a kind of claim of popular sovereignty as refusal that I think is not going to help us address the climate crisis, right? There's lots of ways of trying to delegitimize the institutions of liberal democracy, and not all of them are like in the service of answering the climate crisis. Some of them are in the service of deepening them and replacing it with something even less democratic, right? And so I think that there are lots of ways of invoking the people. Part of what I tried to do here is just sort of not just catalog them, but explain why some of those claims operate as they do, to try and get at some of the underlying logic of these claims about what it means to say, like, the people are taking back control, or the people refuse this.
One really interesting thing, too, about that example is they were certainly tied to the classical Hobbesian notion of state sovereignty that you mentioned, and then they showed up and looked around for where the power was and kept looking under desks and couldn't find it. So I think it is really an interesting comparison. We have time for one more question.
I don't know that much about this, but what about post-war socialism and the development of the welfare state and democracy? Wouldn't that be a populist movement that followed after the Second World War that made a huge, massive change in the world governments, people?
Well, I think it'll depend on the country. So I think in a lot of countries, the post-World War II development of the national welfare state was, I mean, unfortunately, the case I know best is the United States, where a lot of what happened was a result of wildcat labor action and various ways of trying to refuse cooperation in certain kinds of ways. So the United States, the development of the welfare state is obviously more incomplete than in lots of other places. It might not be the most representative example. But I think one of the things that characterized the welfare state after World War II was that redistribution was easier because there was an expectation of massive economic growth. And so people were willing to, to share because they thought there would be more and more. And people don't feel that way about the world anymore. Both for some good reasons that we need to change the way production happens, and for some bad reasons, right? That economic profitability has slowed, and so companies are doing more to kind of extract more and more from workers so that they can get more profit, squeeze more lemon out of a juice that's already been squeezed. So I don't know that the conditions that characterized the growth of the welfare state after World War II are really applicable to us right now. People's expectations are quite different, and so we need to think about, I think, different ways of trying to get people to think about equality and to think about the economy, both because of the climate crisis and also because we're just in a different moment of sort of global capitalism.
Everyone to join us at the reception just now. Let's eat together and keep talking about these interesting ideas. Before we do that, please join me in thanking Ben one more time.